Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on the Fairness for Farmworkers Act, Equity for Farm Workers. We have a panel of three uh, awesome advocates from Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Maine, here to talk about specifically the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, which, if passed in Massachusetts, would entitle farm workers to the guaranteed state minimum wage, to state overtime protections, state overtime pay, and a day of rest, a weekly day of rest. And so we're also going to just talk about other advocacy efforts in other nearby states also, their wins, their challenges, their strategies, here in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Maine. So let's start off with if our panelists could introduce themselves. Claudia, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Hi, everybody. My name is Claudia Quintero. I'm the staff attorney at Central West Justice Center, an affiliate of Community Legal Aid here in Massachusetts, and I run the Migrant and Seasonal Farm Worker Project. I've been doing that for a few years, and there we provide direct legal services to farm workers that have any sort of civil legal need. We also do community outreach and know your rights trainings, and we also do advocacy on a state and sometimes on a national level for farm workers. So happy to be here.
And thank you. And Lerae, how about if you would introduce yourself to the
Sure. Hi. Hi, my name is Lerae Kroon. I am the lead advocacy attorney at Justice at Work, Pennsylvania. Our organization was formerly known as Friends of Farm Workers and has a 40+ year history of providing direct free legal services to the workers in Pennsylvania. We changed our name because in addition to working advocating and representing farm workers, we also work with largely immigrant workforce across low-wage industries in Pennsylvania. I'm also happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. And Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Guare. I am a staff attorney at Pine Tree Legal Assistance in Bangor, Maine. I am in our farm worker unit, and we do very similar work to Claudia and Lerae. We provide free legal assistance to farm workers with a focus on employment-related issues. We also do a lot of outreach, both community-based outreach, but also very direct outreach by visiting labor camps and other sites where workers live, and provide legal services when we can, and when we can't, we do our best to make sure that people find the right resource. Thank you.
Well, thank you all three of you for joining us for this conversation. And let's start off a little bit with just a sort of grander discussion in the context of farm workers, the demographics of those who comprise the farm worker labor force in your states, and also a little bit about the legal context, whether sort of what the minimum wage is, what legal protections that apply to workers generally do or don't apply to farm workers. Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start, and we can go the same order. In Massachusetts, farm worker population tends to be a mixture of domestic workers and some foreign workers. So we do have a number of workers that come in on H-2A visas to work on our farms. And we also have domestic workers that live and work in Massachusetts year-round. Whether they're working on the farms year-round is a different issue, but many times they're living here year-round and working in agriculture and then other industries during the off-season. And the laws regarding farm workers currently as they stand there's an agricultural sub minimum wage in Massachusetts of $8 an hour. That sub minimum wage is still on the books, but many farmers are paying more than $8 an hour. Sometimes even up to the state minimum wage of $14.25, and sometimes even more. In regard to overtime, farm workers are still exempt from overtime under state and federal law. And so it's rare to see any farm worker earning any overtime, though we have seen it. And then there's a few other laws that they're exempt from, such like as acquiring or being eligible to use unemployment benefits during the off season and things like that. So that's sort of the status quo for farm workers right now. Other than that, all of the other laws that apply to other low wage workers generally apply to farm workers, with the exception of these 3 differentiations.
And Lerae?
Sure. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, our farm worker workforce is similar to what Claudia described in Massachusetts. We have a lot of year-round domestic workers, many of them coming originally from Mexico or Central America, and now working across the state. I should have mentioned before that I'm in our Pittsburgh office, but Justice at Work Pennsylvania is a statewide organization. And because Pennsylvania is a fairly large state, we cover workers in all sorts of industries. So a lot of the folks who come in on a temporary basis through the H-2A temporary agriculture visa program, again, come from Mexico and from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and often work in industries that include stone fruit production, vegetables. We have a decent nursery industry here that gets the H-2A program provides workforce for. But our biggest industries in Pennsylvania are actually the dairy industry and the mushroom industry. Pennsylvania has a town that produces, I think, 60% or even more of the United States mushroom commodities. So there are certain things that have sort of been carved out as different protections for these different industries. Generally, the protections for workers in Pennsylvania are pretty dismal. Our state minimum wage is $7.25, but our year-round agricultural workers are exempted from that. Like Claudia was mentioning, we generally see people being paid at least that and sometimes more, but there's no legal protection for even minimum wage for year-round agricultural workers. We do have a seasonal Farm Labor Protection Act. So if someone is qualified as a seasonal farm laborer, they are entitled to the minimum wage, but no agricultural workers are entitled to overtime pay. There are exemptions under state law from protections of our Human Relations Anti-Discrimination Act, from the ability to engage in collective bargaining, with a few caveats, including mushroom workers, which was a big fight, and fully accessing our unemployment compensation system. And I will talk more about all of this, but that's sort of the big picture of what we're working with in Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. And Mike, if you can give us some context.
I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Here in Maine, we have a very interesting mix of workers, which is in many ways similar to what Lerae and Claudia have in their states. We have H-2A workers from both Jamaica and from Mexico and Central America. We have domestic workers. We don't have very many workers who live year-round in Maine, but we have domestic farm workers who come to Maine primarily for blueberries and apples. I'm sorry, and the wreath making industry, which has become the largest employer here in Maine of migrant workers in the whole state. It has overtaken our wild blueberry crop by quite a large number of workers. And We also have two very interesting things here in Maine that don't exist in a lot of other places. We have a southward migration of workers from Canada. We still have Native Americans from reservations in Maine and reserves in Canada who come to Maine. And we also have a significant population of Haitian workers here in Maine who are mostly based in Florida, but who travel north from Florida through North Carolina, through New Jersey, and then come to Maine for blueberries. When blueberries are over, they will then usually either go back to Florida for a short time or go to Pennsylvania or New York and work in apples and then come back to Maine for wreaths. The number of as you can imagine, in a state like Maine, the number of people who speak interpretation quality Creole, you can count on one hand, and it was a real challenge for us to communicate with a lot of these workers. But we've managed to find enough resource to do that, and most of the litigation that we've had in recent years has been on behalf of Haitian workers. And Ben, I have to say that giant picture of my mouth moving in the background is a little bit disconcerting, but I'll try not to look at it. But thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those helpful summaries of
Ben, I'm sorry, I forgot half of what I was supposed to say. Here in Maine, the state minimum wage is $12.75. Farm workers are exempt from the state minimum wage and from overtime, and are also there's no collective bargaining legislation for farm workers at all. Sorry, thank you.
No, thank you very much. So moving into sort of our conversation about what some of the efforts your organizations have been undertaking on behalf of farm workers and to benefit farm workers. We can stay in this order for now that we've been going through. So we'll send this question first to Claudia. Can you tell us a little bit about the legislative and other statewide advocacy that's going on in Massachusetts to benefit farm workers?
Yeah, so, and I agree with you, Mike. Seeing your face up in the corner over there could be a little distracting. So in Massachusetts, recently we filed, and when I say we, I mean labor advocates filed a bill in the state legislature that would eliminate the sub minimum wage for farm workers of $8 an hour and allow them to earn the state minimum wage as it stands or as it continues to rise. So it would create parity with any other low wage worker in Massachusetts, eliminating the distinction between agricultural workers and any other worker. We also proposed in our legislation different overtime thresholds, and this was in sort of response to some of the things that we've been seeing across the country, other states have been doing. But even just nearby, New York passed a law last year allowing farm workers to earn overtime pay at 60 hours rather than 40 hours, because traditionally workers earn overtime at 40 hours of overtime in any given week. But we recognize that farm workers have unique and differing work schedules compared to other workers. And so given that New York, took that into consideration as well, and their initial loss is at 60 hours. So we proposed 55 hours in our legislation as a threshold overtime hours work per week for seasonal workers, because we know that the seasonal aspect is a really important aspect in Massachusetts, given the nature of our weather and all of those considerations. And then for full-time workers, we don't think that full-time agricultural workers, and we've been in conversation with a lot of different stakeholders, including growers, about sort of like why full-time workers, or I should say year-round workers rather, should be exempt from overtime, or why they should have a higher threshold than any other worker who's working in any other industry year round. So for year round workers, the proposal is 40 hours of a work week that they would be entitled to overtime. And then similarly, we are also proposing a day of rest for farm workers, because New York also has that in their law now. But we think it's really important that, given the workforce population that works on the farms, that a day of rest guaranteed gives farm workers a level of comfort, knowing that if they need to take a day off, one, to recover from the hard work that is farming and farm work, that they don't feel like they're gonna lose their job, or they feel like they're not allowed to take time off for any sort of familial obligation, religious obligation, etc. So those are sort of the things that we've incorporated into our legislation. It went to committee last session. We had a lot of conversation about it with the Joint Committee on Labor and Workforce Development about what this bill would mean. They heard from farm workers directly, they heard from farmers directly, they heard from stakeholders directly involved in the labor movement, involved in agriculture and other sectors, food justice, etc. And ultimately, there's still more work to be done because our bill didn't make it past that stage. But we feel like there's a lot that we've gotten done so far. And there are people who support this bill, both in the legislature and both outside of the legislature, who want to do right by the workers and create some sort of parity for them, while at the same time being cognizant and aware of the needs and concerns of farmers and growers. So we're working diligently to think about what are ways that we could support growers. And I think here, one of the things that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but for those of you in the audience thinking about ways that, like things that advocates who are on the labor side should be aware of, or should be thinking about in ways of creative problem solving in this regard. I mean, as an example, in Oregon, just this year, they passed an overtime bill as well. And as part of their bill, they have incorporated tax credits to growers that would help them offset the cost of increased labor costs now that farm workers are going to be entitled to overtime. And we've been in conversation with advocates in Oregon about what does that look like. Obviously, they don't know, it's just brand new, it's just getting started. But thinking about what are some ways that could be offset, and what are the conversations that need to be had about, like, obviously, if the cost of everything remains the same, if the cost of inflation and everything, and labor prices, the cost of labor is increasing because we're wanting people to be compensated a living wage. How can the state help both sides in a way that is supportive to both, not at the expense of one? And so those are conversations that we're having now as we think about ways that we can move forward with this legislation, because we don't want Massachusetts to fall behind other states like New York and Washington and Oregon and Colorado and California and Minnesota, all states that offer overtime pay to their workers. So that's sort of where we are now. We work a lot nationally in this regard, trying to see what other states are doing. And we are also trying to put together information so that people are informed on what's happening. We published a white paper on, and if anybody wants to see our white paper, we can circulate it, we can share with organizers on sort of like what's the status of farm workers in Massachusetts, who comprise these farm workers, where are they working, where are they located in the state, and what is the history of this law. So we've got all that in a white paper that we published last year. And yeah, that's sort of where we're at right now. So if that raises any questions, write them down so you can ask us towards the end. But I'm going to throw this over to Lerae.
Thanks, Claudia. So in Pennsylvania, we have done a little bit of affirmative legislative work. So in spring of 2021, we worked with a group of state representatives to introduce what we're calling the Equal Rights for Agricultural Workers in Pennsylvania Omnibus Bill. So it would do several things. It would amend our Seasonal Farm Labor Act to include year-round agricultural work. It would extend the right to engage in self-organization and collective bargaining for agricultural workers. It would eliminate the exemption from the minimum wage and overtime provisions. And it would extend anti-discrimination protections that are currently not available to farm workers to them. So we were in sort of an interesting position when it came to drafting and introducing this bill, in that we were approached by some of these legislators who were inspired by what was happening in New York and wanted to move forward in introducing something similar in Pennsylvania, in part because we do share in some ways a workforce. We're bordering states, and especially the dairy workers that we encounter in Pennsylvania have strong ties to New York, and there's some seasonal migration between the two states. So that sort of put the fire under these legislators to try to take action. And in particular, one of the legislators who was very sort of proactive about this is from here in Pittsburgh, and labor rights are very important to him. So for him, really what was driving this legislation was the ability to engage in collective bargaining and to take collective action to better their lives and workplaces of the farm workers in Pennsylvania. So we came in kind of late in the process, I would say, and did a lot of work to try to get something together pretty quickly. The legislators wanted to move forward and introduce it, and we had about a month or two. So we were able to provide a lot of feedback and drafting, and had some great conversations with those legislators, and did get the bill introduced. And then it went to our labor committee, and it has been sitting there for a year and a half. And we sort of knew at the beginning of this process that this wasn't going to be the bill that went forward, absent some dramatic changes to the makeup of our state legislature. But really what we knew and we're really facing and grappling with now is that doing it this way wouldn't include the voices of many of the people who would be affected by this change in legislation. And so at the stage we're in now, I see it as sort of a rebuilding stage where we're working hard to connect with community groups and farm workers and growers and business organizations to try to start a real dialogue about what would work well in Pennsylvania to keep us moving forward and to allow us to remain competitive when it comes to the workforce with neighboring states, but also do so in a way that involves, for me, most importantly, the voices of the farm workers who have been living under what I consider to be a very broken system for a long time. So this bill isn't technically dead, but we are looking forward to future legislative sessions and trying to build the type of movement that I think that has been happening in Massachusetts and states where this has been successful. And we know that's going to take time and a lot of effort and a lot of voices, and that's where we are right now.
Thank you. And Mike, if you could share with us the situation in Maine and the efforts that have been going on in Maine.
Here in Maine, we are going into a legislative session in January, which will be the third time that we will have tried to get legislation passed. That there were actually 2 or 3 different bills that we've been trying to get passed. One is a farm worker to eliminate the exemption from the state minimum wage law for farm workers that prevents them from getting minimum wage and from being eligible for overtime. We also have introduced twice now a bill that would grant collective bargaining rights to farm workers. And there was also a bill that, similar to a bill that was passed in California a few years ago, providing certain health and safety protections for farm workers in extreme heat, which is something that doesn't occur quite as badly as it does in some of the southern and western states here in Maine. But there are days here in Maine where, I mean, we've had workers who've collapsed on when it gets really bad, and that bill was also introduced. The first time we introduced the, when I say we, I don't mean I mean the primary sponsor of our bills was a former legal services lawyer who worked for a while at the state attorney general's office and subsequently became a state legislator. And when he was working for legal services, he actually did Farmworker legal services in New York State and had a real understanding of the issues. And the first year, the bills didn't get out of committee. We got one of those results where you get referred to a commission, so to speak. The Department of Labor, the compromise that was reached was that the Department of Labor, the State Department of Labor, was to convene the shareholders for further discussions to see if something could emerge from those discussions. Unfortunately, nothing substantial really did. The next year, the bills were reintroduced, and the collective bargaining bill actually passed our legislature, but was vetoed by the governor, who was a Democrat. And needless to say, there was a great deal of consternation on our side when that happened. We're cautiously, perhaps, not. Yeah, we're hoping that that when her re-election problem is over, she's up for election again this year and is facing a very serious challenge from a far-right candidate. And we're hoping that if she wins re-election and that pressure is off, she might be more willing to sign a bill that passes. The minimum wage and overtime bill got out of committee, but did not pass the legislature. I'm happy to say that even though our primary sponsor that I was just telling you about is not running for re-election, I spoke to him just the other day, and he tells me that the bills will be brought forward again this session. He mentioned a number of legislators by name that he thought would be very interested. And as it happens, one of our best allies in the legislature, we just happen to have a Black American man who is the owner of a small farm, who is the Senate, the co-chair of the State Labor Relations Committee. And the history of these exclusions really resonated with him. And I think he will be a very powerful advocate in this coming session. And by the way, the history that I'm talking about just briefly is that there's no inherent or intrinsic logic that has anything to do with the nature of the work or the nature of farming or the nature of agriculture in the United States that requires farm workers to be exempt from overtime or from collective bargaining or from any of the other protections that they might not enjoy. Those exemptions are the result of basically a political deal that was struck back in the 1930s when all of the federal law that requires the minimum wage, the federal law that gives people the right to form unions and act collectively, and many other laws were all passed during the New Deal. But in order to get these pieces of legislation passed, there was an agreement basically to exclude farm workers and domestic workers from the provisions of these laws in order to gain the support of Southern congressional representatives and senators. And as you can imagine, back in the 30s, most of the workers who did those kinds of jobs, farm work and domestic work, were Black. And that is essentially the reason why those exclusions existed in the first place. And they have they remain alive in many places today. I did not know this until I was working on supporting the last legislative attempt. Farm workers were even excluded from the Social Security Act when it was first passed. I didn't know that, and that has since been fixed. But they still don't have the right to overtime. They still don't have the right to collectively bargain, and we're we're going into our third year. I've heard many people say that sometimes it takes 3 years or more to get legislation passed, and we got one of the bills to the governor last time, so we're very cautiously optimistic that we might get a little farther this year.
That's really really helpful and a useful history, and it kind of leads into another question, which is how, I guess I'm going to sort of combine two questions and send it back to all three of you, which is how have you worked to sort of frame the issues surrounding these legislative efforts, and whether when talking to community stakeholders, community partners, legislators, etc., and how have you handled concerns that employers have expressed that they feel are presented by these bills? And Claudia, let's start with you.
Well, I think from the outset, what I would say, and maybe people in the audience might sort of like, what's that word when you kind of understand, empathize or not, you might relate. The first thing that we noticed when we first started this whole process is how little people outside of agriculture know about agriculture. So many of the legislators that we reached out to and community stakeholders were shocked to learn that we have farms in Massachusetts even. As most people know, Massachusetts can be very Boston centric. And so our state house is out there, a lot of legislators that do advocacy are out there. And so people were like, there are farms in Massachusetts? They were like, yes. West of Framingham, there are many farms actually, and north of Boston even. And so in educating people about sort of just very basically about how the agricultural sector operates in Massachusetts, what are our biggest commodities, who are the workers, who are the growers, all of these things is like a very first step process to getting people on board. And then once people get a sense of, oh, okay, well, there are farms here and I'm probably eating food from these farms, then people feel a little bit more of like they have an interest in the matter. And then we, sort of educate them on the laws, and people are initially surprised that farm workers are exempt from overtime. They have no such idea. And so then there's like this moral outrage that occurs that's so horrible. How can such a thing occur when people are working so hard? And so as we're framing the issue, we try to be inclusive in the approach. It's not an issue of farmer versus farm worker or farmers are doing anything wrong. It's an issue of there is this law that is on the books that exempts farm workers from overtime and keeps them in a state of poverty essentially because they're not guaranteed a minimum wage, and the state has to do something about it. It's wonderful that there are growers that pay workers more. It's wonderful there are growers who are willing to create equity for their own workers, but the responsibility should really be on the state to right this wrong, to correct these laws. And so that's really our narrative, our framing of the issue. Like how can we work together to encourage Massachusetts to want to see this unseen population, which often gets forgotten, to consider their needs and to do something that will elevate the workers and dignify the work that they do, but also recognizing that growers might need help doing this, and how can we do it together? You know, and it's like one, it's like a moral issue of this is wrong and it shouldn't exist, and we need to fix it, and also an education campaign to educate people that this population exists in our state and they need advocacy just like any other advocate. And I think during the pandemic, we were very hyper focused on, you know, parents with children and childcare and healthcare issues and all of these things, essential workers. And yet we deemed farm workers an essential workforce and yet didn't do anything to protect them and make sure that they were compensated fairly. So many of the farm workers that were working on farms that got COVID were exempt from being able to get any of the coronavirus Families First bill that came out on the federal level. Many of them were not eligible for the stimulus money that was given to workers. And so these are things that we have to educate people about and like keep in conversation. So, and then the other thing, Ben, your question about sort of like how do employers react to this, and you know, sometimes employers get frustrated. We hear that, you know, it's hard to like the profit margins are slim and there's a lot of expenditures and there's a lot of regulation, especially if you have H-2A workers and things of that nature, that it becomes overly burdensome and difficult for growers to find a way to pay their workers more, because it, you know, where's the money going to come from? We recognize that everybody's struggling. So we're thinking, how can we get the state to help? Like, what are creative ways that we can find avenues of assistance? Because we don't want the burden to be entirely on growers necessarily if that's not feasible, but we don't want it to be at the expense of the workers either. So we talk to them about that, and we have different conversations with different types of growers. We are aware of the difference between wholesale producers and like direct to consumer producers and the different needs that different commodities growers have. And I didn't mention this in our bill, but like we had a lot of conversation with cranberry growers. In Massachusetts, we know that the cranberry industry produces a lot of the cranberries that we use nationwide. And we know that the harvesting season for cranberries is different than for other produce, you know, typical vegetables and fruits. And so that's something we took into consideration when we drafted our bill. And there's like a carve out for that industry. So hearing directly from growers is really important to us, because I am not an expert on agriculture. I know the laws well, and I know my farm worker population well, but I'm not a farmer. So I can only rely on the information that I get from growers, that I get from farm workers, to make the best suggestion I can to the state. And so we do want to work in coalition in tandem with growers, and we have been. The Department of Labor Standards back last year hosted 2 listening sessions, one in Amherst actually at UMass and one in Worcester. And we went out and we heard from farmers directly about what are the different things that they need and what are the different concerns. And I mean, yeah, it's hard to draft a bill that speaks directly to the needs of every single farmer, but we are trying to be as considerate as we can as we're thinking about what are the needs of farmers and farm workers. So yeah, coming to the table and working together is probably going to be the best approach that we have for growers. And we say, you know, it's not that you're doing anything wrong as a farmer, as an employer. We just don't think that this law should exist, because it's not fair for these workers, and it's not something that we should be perpetuating for years to come, especially in this time and age. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's so interesting. It's sort of shifting the framing from, like you said, from being farm workers in conflict with farmers, with farm owners, to this is essentially a regulatory failing. Like, this is an issue that the state has a responsibility to set the ground rules for. And
Lerae, and then that it's morally reprehensible that like we have these laws that have just been perpetuated for so many years that come from such a sordid agreement that just kind of continues and nobody questions why, and it just sort of perpetuates this exclusion that is racially based, even though it's it's framed as like an occupational exclusion. So it's just, we cannot allow it in this time and age. But yeah, sorry, Lerae.
No, it's actually the perfect lead into what I was going to say, which is I think some of those moral arguments are less available and less persuasive to us in Pennsylvania, unfortunately. So I don't know how many attendees are familiar with sort of the political makeup of Pennsylvania, but we really have these two sort of more progressive-ish cities in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but most of the state and almost all of the agricultural land is in the middle, where we have a very, very conservative population. And we also have an issue, as many places in the country do, with the rise of white nationalism. So as I mentioned earlier, I think we're still working through framings and reaching different groups and how to talk about all the different things. But it's seeming like we can get people to table to talk about it when we're focusing more on the economic side of things. And, a next step for me is really going to be working with some of our allies who have a more economic minded way of looking at these issues and trying to understand better what the impact of a more competitive and equitable labor structure would look like and what the benefits could be to the state. And there's a lot of things that go into it. Pennsylvania farm workers are some of the least studied farm workers in the country. So, we're partnering with different research institutions to try to understand better what the patterns are and what the conditions in labor camps are, and what's actually happening out there. Part of that is what we at Justice at Work do every season, which is a lot of outreach out to farm labor camps. And in addition to talking about the existing rights, we're trying to expand to better understand what farm workers themselves say are the biggest issues facing them, and just to try to get a better picture of what we're looking at. And then again, I think I even hinted at this earlier, like talking about keeping up with our neighbors and talking about trying to move the industry forward is probably going to be, at least publicly, one of the main talking points. But I think it's going to be really interesting to balance that with the core population that we want to be working with on this, which are the workers themselves and other worker communities and immigrant communities, because there is, like, I feel in my heart like this is unjust. It's based in racism. It is putting unfair pressure on workers, and their labor is being used in ways that benefit others. And our organization does a lot of work with labor trafficking, and so it's a mindset that I'm in, where it's like, this is bad and we have to fix it. And I want to recognize the experiences of Pennsylvania workers and to include that in our messaging too, and try to strike the balance between like what can happen when you have an exploitative structure like this in place, and why it's important to change it for the workers who are affected by it day to day and their families and their communities, but also try to avoid a bad guy, good guy situation where we can't get any of the people to the table who can help move things forward, like the way you're talking about, Claudia, who are impacted as well in different ways and would be necessary in a state like ours, where again, most of the agricultural land has very conservative representation. We're just going to have to come up with ways to move things forward, even if they're not exactly, well, even if some of it feels a little bit disingenuous in terms of like how we're talking about it. But I'm not a politician and I never will be. I'm a legal aid lawyer. And so I'm looking to allies to sort of think through those types of trade-offs and framings and how we move forward in a way that's respectful, but also effective.
Yeah,
Mike?
I mean, if I can just add in one thing you said, Lerae, we did in Massachusetts have gone the economic route as well. We've commissioned a few studies in Massachusetts on the economic issue of what it would cost to pay overtime to farm workers and things like that, and what that would look like from people much smarter than me in that regard. And it's a hard thing to do because the pushback that we got was, well, this isn't like a real life. There's so many factors that you have to take into consideration that even your analysis of this is flawed because you're looking at it from like a very one singular approach. And so the economic argument was always falling short. So I think it's got to be like a mixture of things, like you have to show that it's economically feasible if Massachusetts as a state is willing to support in some way. And also, like, in addition to that, this law is wrong. And so it's like a multifaceted approach. I don't think it's just one thing, but I mean, I can recognize how it would be difficult in a place where the racial element of it all is, just going to anger or trigger more animus.
Yeah, I think there's just some like careful constructed arguments that may seem really basic. I hope they feel basic to many of the people in this room, but your response to, for example, undocumented farm workers deserving a fair wage can't be, well, they shouldn't be here anyway, because it's a reality of our, agricultural labor. And to just have a very reductionist mindset about whether someone who is here without work authorization is entitled to a fair wage or not, and just saying everyone should leave, like, you have to think a few more steps ahead of that. And I think there's some education and just like, more discussion across the state to try to shift a little bit, at least, the thinking about these types of things. That we have a hill ahead of us, and I know it's not going to be a quick change. And I also know that not everyone in Pennsylvania feels that way. I'm not trying to generalize too much, but again, after going through this past session and everything just getting stuck and hearing some of the responses from some more conservative legislators about this, we have a long ways to go.
And are those the responses that you're getting? Are you getting sort of economics based, like arguments about the economics of farming, essentially?
I mean, really, we're not even getting that. We're just getting, this is never going to happen. Like farmers are powerful in the state, and that's true. And it's a reality we have to contend with. But I think that part of what our next phase is going to be is getting this taken more seriously in a state where we don't have the political power to move it forward without some people who right now are not even engaging with the issue starting to engage. Sorry, Mike.
No, don't apologize. That was really good. Here in Maine, and Lerae, this is not to say that you shouldn't keep this as part of your messaging, but we found that the notion or the argument that we should be at least as good as other states and be doing what has already been done in New York and California and other places did not have much traction here in Maine. Maine has a very bad case of we are Maine and we are different than everybody else, and we don't need people in New York telling us what to do. We don't need people in New Hampshire telling us what to do. And so we, that argument did not play very well. So what we tried to do was basically turn it on its head. And this argument would, well, the basic thrust of our argument in this last session was that these laws are unjust. They are, as Claudia said, they are morally reprehensible. This is based in racism. And here in Maine, that is not who we are, and we should change it. And it's up to us to change it. And we went pretty much all the way with that argument. We actually had the Labor Committee conducted a work session in which there was a presentation made by a historian from the state university system that traced the history from slavery to the concentration of Black workers in agriculture in the 30s, how that resulted in the political deal that resulted in the exemptions that we're trying to fix now. And it drew a very straight line all the way from slavery to the present day. Now that is a bit of a tightrope, that argument, because it is very easy, if you don't do it right, it's very easy to have people construe it as saying that they are racist, that the farm workers here that the farmers here in Maine are racist and are doing this and are not paying overtime and are not allowing collective bargaining because they are racist. And actually, we had some serious blowback on that very issue the very first time we proposed legislation, because we didn't, looking back now, we realized that there were some mistakes in the way we presented that argument, and we did it much better this last time. And I think it began to work, because, as I said, we got at least one of the bills all the way to the governor, and the economic argument, we attempted to sort of fight fire with fire on the economic argument. As you can imagine, all the testimony, there was very little opposition actually to the collective bargaining bill from the growers. And there was very little opposition to raising the minimum wage from the growers, because the economic reality is that most of them already pay at or above the minimum wage, because if they didn't, they would not be able to attract workers. And the big pushback was on overtime. And, we can't, just like Claudia and Lerae said, we can't afford it. We'll go bankrupt. We had farmer after farmer, not the big ones, but they did their work well. They had lots of small farmers come and testify about the margins they operate under, and how the people that buy their produce and their products tell them what they're going to pay. They don't set the prices. The prices are set by the buyers. And the most telling argument of all was the one that you can probably imagine, which is, and I think there's a kernel of truth in this, which is that if we have to pay overtime, then we're going to have to stop people from working after 40 hours. And the workers themselves are going to be upset about that. They're not going to like that. And that's a difficult argument to deal with. And so the answer we attempted to come up with this time was to do what they did in California, which was to have a phase in and have overtime take effect after a certain number of hours that decrease over time. I believe California's phase-in is not actually complete until 2025 or 2026. I don't remember for sure. And we tried that approach, but it didn't work. I think that, one of the things that Claudia said early on was something that they had done in Oregon, which was, I think I had heard that, but it didn't really sink in until right now. The idea of tax credits to offset the increased labor costs that would be represented by paying overtime. I think that that's something that's very much worth exploring here in Maine, because that would go, if we could get the government, the state government, to agree to do something like that. And there are some sympathetic people in the government, including we have a very good labor commissioner, for example. That would go a long way towards dealing with that concern. But so far, our approach has been, this is wrong. This isn't Maine. We need to fix it. And it's been only a little successful so far, but we're going to keep pushing.
Well, speaking of making progress and continuing to push, before we go to questions, I wanted to ask y'all one more question, where I'm going to sort of, again, fold a couple questions in together, and I want to talk about both the role of community partners, how sort of the voices or the interests of community partners have been leveraged um, in moving these efforts forward, and also what tips or strategies you could share with others that would be interested in supporting this legislative advocacy. So Claudia, let's start.
So in terms of community partners, like Lerae had mentioned, for us, the voice of farm workers is very important. I know the law and I know what I know, but I'm not a farm worker and I can't speak for farm workers. So we've been working a lot with organizations across the state that work closely with farm workers, worker centers, other organizations that work with farm workers, to have them sort of take the farm worker voice element of this. So we're working in coalition. We've started an entity called the Fairness for Farm Workers Coalition, and it's comprised of entities across the state, organizations across the state that are interested in the issue and working with work with farm workers. And we have folks that are directly in contact with farm workers. We're also in contact with farm workers ourselves. And we pull the workers, we'll say, because one of the issues that you raised, Mike, about, if we cap it at 40 hours and then growers cap them at 40 hours, then they're losing hours. That's not what we want for the workforce either. So when we decided sort of like what is going to be the threshold hours for overtime, we didn't decide that arbitrarily. We did that in conversation with farm workers. What do you want? What hours seem like, what are your average work hours? What's going to make more sense for you? How often do you work more than 55? All of those conversations. And it was the farm workers who ultimately voted on what they wanted these hours to be. We also have farm workers testify at any hearings, so that farm legislators can hear directly from farm workers and ask them questions. We provide interpreters if they need it, so that they feel empowered to speak in the language that they're comfortable with. We host, anytime we meet with legislators, we have farm worker representatives meet in the meetings so that they're also included in the conversation, because that's really important to us. And then in regard to other community organizations, we talk to organizations that work with farm workers and immigrant workers to say, hey, like, here's something we're working on. Like, how can you support this effort? What are the needs that you feel like we're not addressing? We work a lot with healthcare providers to get a better sense of sort of like, what are you seeing? And then including just recently, Massachusetts passed the legislature passed the driver's license bill in Massachusetts for undocumented folks in the state. And we were in conversation with that coalition to say, like, how is what we're doing affecting what you're doing? How is what you're doing going to affect us? And how can we work together in being aware of that? And so we're always working in tandem. We don't work in a vacuum. We're always working in coalition. We want to understand the needs of the community as they're changing, especially during the pandemic. Things changed rapidly. And so we're trying to, stay informed and have our boots on the ground approach. And then in ways that folks can get involved. I mean, if people are interested in the issue, whether they're growers, farm workers, whomever, or adjacent to any of these groups, allies, and you want to support, you can get in touch with us to get onto our listserv. We do have a listserv that we send out from time to time. When we refile our legislation this session, reaching out to your legislators about this issue is really important, because the more they hear from the community that this issue matters to you and that it's something that should be considered, the more that legislators are going to realize that the community at large is aware and wants this too. they get tired of hearing from me. They probably see my name come up on their phone or their email and they just shield away because, oh, here she comes again. But if they're hearing from the community at large that this is an issue that is important to the community too, they might take it more seriously as well. So they need to be hearing from all sorts of people. So there are ways, those are the ways that folks can get involved, supporting farm workers, standing in solidarity. Sometimes we have press events where farm workers will talk to legislators or the press or whomever, and showing up and showing support for the workers is really important. I know we're all really busy, but even just 10 minutes stopping by would mean the world to them, because they work hard and they feed us. And one of the things that for me is really like important is when we have farm workers testify to hearings or whatever, like I don't coach anybody. I just say, listen, I just want you to say how you feel. I want you to talk about what your experience is as a worker. And of their own volition, a lot of times workers will say, I don't feel dignified in the work that I do. I don't feel like anybody appreciates me for the work that I do. And I know that I'm feeding people in this state. I know that the vegetables and the fruits and the whatever that they're eating are coming from me. And yet I feel so unseen and so unappreciated. And I know that that's how they feel, but to hear it directly from a worker, to know that day in, day out, they're doing this work and they feel like nobody cares that this is what they're doing. It just kind of puts it in a different light. And so, yeah, just even showing appreciation for the workers, you see them picking things, thank you, just even if you're a grower and you have workers, thank them for the work they do. It's hard work. I don't think I think one time I tried to pick some strawberries at pick your own, and it was hot and I got tired. So I'm grateful for all the work agricultural folks do, workers and growers. But yeah, anyway, so I'm gonna get off my soapbox, but Lerae, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add, just because, as I've mentioned before, we're in the building stage right now. And also, I know from workers I've spoken to and coalition groups that this is a really important area. And every time I do know your rights about labor rights in Pennsylvania and talk about the agricultural exemption, to a person, everyone feels like this is very unjust. But we have a few wonderful and very active statewide immigrant right coalitions and worker rights coalitions. And it's kind of funny you mentioned the driver's license bill, Claudia, because we are deep in that. It's a huge priority right now, and there's not a lot of space for these partners to take on other stuff right now. So I'm also trying to balance supporting them, because I feel like an important part of my job as an attorney is to lend what I can to movements made up of the workers that I'm trying to represent and advocate for, and not try to push my agenda, and sort of just continue to talk about this and try to build coalitions and move the work forward. And at this stage right now, it's pretty new. So I've been taking notes about what you've been saying and what Mike's said and will say, as we try to think about the best way to do this going forward, and hopefully to formalize it and make it a little bit of a more powerful space to move these particular issues forward. But I recognize it can't be, and I don't think it's just I who care about this. I think there's a lot of people who care about it, but I'm struggling a little bit to balance, I'm ready to do this now, but maybe not everyone else is, and we just need to do more relationship building at this point.
And Mike?
I really don't have anything to add to what Lerae and Claudia said. I think those are the key themes, to involve workers, to spread the net as wide as possible and get as many folks active and pushing for the same thing as possible. It's easy to say, very challenging to do, but it's the way forward.
I did think of one thing, which is, I'm not sure we've talked much about trying to loop labor in to some of these issues. And that's something I've been doing or working on for a long time, trying to make sure that the labor movement sees immigrant workers and farm workers as part of their movement, and to try to draw those connections. And there's some really promising and exciting things happening with that in Pennsylvania. And even the fact that this most recent legislation got the ball was rolling by somebody who cared about the collective bargaining rights or the right to organize of workers, I think is telling about harnessing some of the power that is the wings of that movement right now, as we see more workplaces across all sorts of industries recognizing the importance of worker solidarity and worker power, and drawing the lines between what that portion of these changing laws could accomplish for making a more equitable and just labor system. And I'm even more inspired to keep doing that, hearing that the piece of your legislation, Mike, that got the farthest is the collective bargaining rights. I think it's a moment to really push that.
And I'm happy to say that the labor folks in Maine are one of our most active and strongest allies. And there's a part of this that tends to get overlooked, which is that there's probably not going to be an active if we were to get collective bargaining rights passed in Maine, there probably isn't going to be anytime soon an active organizing campaign here in Maine. But one of the things that the National Labor Relations Act guarantees, and which our bill would guarantee also, is not just the right to organize and the right to collectively bargain, but the right to engage in any kind of concerted activity. And I've had more than one occasion where I've had meetings with workers who, and I'm sure Claudia and Lerae have had this experience many times as well, where they come to me with a problem that doesn't rise to a violation of the law, either an anti-discrimination law or any of the protective legislation that does apply to farm workers. It's just a bad working situation. Usually it's an abusive crew leader or supervisor who's the same race as the workers. And the advice that you have to give in that circumstance is, well, the best way to deal with this would just be to go and talk to the boss and take this up with the grower and try to resolve it. But if you do that and the grower decides that the best way to deal with this is to fire you, I probably can't do anything to protect you against that. And those are very frustrating conversations, but without the right to engage in concerted activity, if something that happens doesn't happen to violate another law, the workers are just out of luck. And that is even if we don't have a union in the next year or two for farm workers in Maine, I would be delighted if I could tell workers that, yeah, you can talk to each other about what you're making, and you can go and talk to the boss and see if you can work out something to fix a problem, and you can't get fired for it. Or if you do, come see me. I would love if that were the case, but unfortunately right now it's not.
It's such a good point. And I think I have been using the term collective bargaining when I really am, trying to think about collective action, because we have the same dynamic. And one thing that's really powerful in Pennsylvania, which I mentioned before, is that after hard work, there was the right protections under the Pennsylvania Labor Relations Act for mushroom workers, based on some kind of funky drafting where they are categorized as horticultural workers and therefore not excluded from the Labor Relations Act. And it's dramatically different and very powerful for workers to feel like they have the ability to come together and seek change in their places of employment. And it works. And the growers know now that that is something that they need to think carefully about. And retaliation happens, of course, but it's there's some recourse for it, and it happens less frequently as we all sort of understand that this is something that's protected by the law and that workers can come together and seek to better their working conditions. It's also opened the door. We did have a union for a while in the mushroom industry in Pennsylvania. It's since been decertified, but that sort of frame of bettering workplaces by workers themselves has allowed for all sorts of different kinds of organizing and connection in the community of mushroom growers in Pennsylvania that, you see the impacts clearly. You see, that people are more likely to come forward when there's issues. They're more likely to stand up for themselves. There are growers, smaller and bigger, who are very careful and good about implementing these sort of worker protections, and they always have workers. And I think we'll see industry change as if and when, and knock on wood, hopefully it will happen, that this can be duplicated in other industries.
Well,
In Massachusetts, we do have the right to unionize, and it's a very simple process, card check. And that's it. And the labor movement is pretty supportive of it. I'm surprised, efforts are underway, or efforts have been underway previously to unionize farm workers. But the labor movement is very supportive of this bill. We got the backing of several unions in the state, including the AFL-CIO. So we do have a lot of support from the labor movement in that regard. And we've tried to be as expansive as we can with getting support from the labor movement, the religious people in the religious sector, people in the healthcare industry, and food justice advocates. So we're trying to be expansive in our approach to advance equity, because we know that it's not a one lane issue. It affects people in various aspects of their lives, for sure. Ben?
the last thing that I want to do is cut this fascinating discussion short, but we have about 13 minutes left in the session, and we do want to have some time for questions. So I want to open it up to folks both in the room and in the chat, in the Zoom and or through the app for questions. So if you're in the room, I guess raise your hand, and if you're in the Zoom, drop it in the chat.
Yeah, or you can unmute and you will be heard.
Oh.
We do have a comment from Robert. Even here in Massachusetts, the driver's license law, which passed, is threatened by a community group trying to get a question on the ballot to repeal it. It's a constant battle.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. I currently work as an apprentice on a farm in New York, and so I get paid minimum wage, which is really nice. And I'm looking to work in Massachusetts or Maine soon. I'm wondering if these bills would apply to apprentices or volunteers or people starting off. A lot of jobs in Maine say they come with a quote unquote modest stipend, which is kind of insulting. And I'm just wondering if this bill sort of covers that. Even though it's a smaller group of people, but yeah. I don't know if people can hear that on Zoom.
Were y'all able to hear that question?
The several of the states that do provide for overtime and a higher minimum wage for farm workers have a series of exemptions, and I believe that several of those states exempt apprentices, but I don't remember which states, and I don't remember what the exact language of the exemption is. To be perfectly honest, I don't think we have actually wrestled with that particular point here in Maine. It's a good question. I suspect that if we were able to get an overtime provision for farm workers and a minimum wage provision for farm workers, we would be certainly open to discussing reasonable exemptions, one of which might be for apprentices. But I can't really give you much of an answer other than that, because it really hasn't come up.
Yeah, it just makes it really hard to get into the career if you need some other savings or other financial support to start off. Like, why would you go into farming if you could go work at any other job and make more of a living wage? Get paid for your time.
Yeah, in regard to Massachusetts, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it's not an issue we've wrangled with. I mean, the law in Massachusetts says that farm workers are people who plant and harvest. So theoretically, if you're getting paid to plant and harvest, you're a farm worker. If you're not doing that, you're not a farm worker. Yeah, but I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah. Malia put a comment in the chat. Hi, I'm a student in Oregon and just wrote a paper on the overtime bill here. Lerae, you said farmers are powerful in Pennsylvania, but I wonder if the seasonal farm worker might begin to exercise their agency by choosing to work in states that offer overtime. In Oregon, there's a worker shortage and can choose Washington or California where they do pay overtime. Do you think that could be motivation to help pass legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it would be, and I think it would certainly be part of what we would be arguing, especially focusing on neighboring states. But, you know, as we hopefully see a trend with more states passing more worker protections, you know, sort of hitting hard the idea that Pennsylvania shouldn't be left behind and shouldn't be a worse place to work than other places. Practically, I mean, I'm thinking of the workers I frequently encounter and some of my clients. You know, it's never quite so simple, just as like packing up and leaving often, because especially folks who do year-round stuff have kids in schools and you know, communities and stuff here. So I think it's a strategic point to press, and I'm thinking about whether like practically that's something that might actually start happening here. I'm not sure. It's a good question.
When I spoke to the Oregon advocate who helped pass the bill there, he said one of the biggest things for them was the fact that Washington and California offer overtime, and they were losing a lot of their workforce to those states. And that was one of the biggest motivators for Oregon to pass the overtime state, because they weren't able to compete with the laws or the labor force out there. They were like, we were losing all our workers, so we just felt like we had to, because we were sandwiched in between these two states. So I think that argument is harder for us over here on the East Coast, given that only New York is offering overtime, and everybody's like, well, New York's New York, we're not New York. And when we say, you know, well, the folks on the West Coast, Oregon, Washington, California are doing it, they're like, well, we're also not California or these huge states where they have more space for farming than we do. And so it's a kind of a little bit of a harder argument for us to make over here on this side of the country. But hopefully as more states pass it, maybe it'll be easier.
One thing I just want to throw out, which isn't quite the topic of this panel, but I'm watching carefully the Farm Work Modernization Act at the federal level, which could do some pretty big things to shake up the agricultural worker, the seasonal workforce, by expanding the H-2A program. And there's some conflicts right now about trying to extend protections that exist for farm workers here in the United States to workers who come into that program, so that there's not an incentive to sort of disregard these domestic workers or people who've been in this migrant seasonal pattern for a while in favor of these visa workers in a program that has already shown itself to be very vulnerable to exploitation. So just wanted to throw that out there, because I think we're going to have to start to factor in that as we go forward in talking about the state level laws and what protections folks have.
Good point.
I have more questions, but I want to give other people an opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my other question is about paid time off and sick time. I do get a minimal amount of sick time, and it is because of the law in New York. I don't know if it's agricultural or just New York state law. But I'm wondering if you are also advocating for sick time or paid time off in your bills.
So in Massachusetts, sick time is already granted to all workers, including agricultural workers. You start earning sick time as soon as you start working, your first day of work. But there is a 90-day waiting period before you're able to use any of the sick time. But it applies to all workers, regardless of industry. And it's paid if you work for an employer that has 11 or more employees, and it's unpaid if you work for an employer that has 10 or less. And you can use it for yourself or your child or your spouse or your extended family if you live with them. So it's so that's a protection that's already there. We don't need to advocate for it further. We are thinking about ways to include paid time off, but we don't know yet what that's going to look like, and what that'll do for our bill. So working on it, but as far as sick time goes, yeah.
We in Pennsylvania are in the opposite situation where there is no state protection for sick leave, vacation pay, severance pay, or anything like that. We have a few localities that have passed bills that sound somewhat like what Claudia is mentioning in Massachusetts, but since we don't even have a floor to build on for farm workers, it's something that we haven't really engaged with. And to me, it's just an example about how labor protections can influence the rights and abilities to live their lives of all workers, and we're all interconnected.
Yeah, we have a we have a sick leave law in Maine, also quite recent actually. But the way eligibility for it or qualification for the to accrue sick time is defined, most farm workers don't qualify because they don't work for the employer long enough. We don't have a any paid sick time, any paid leave provision here in Maine that I don't think we do anyway. And you know, the question of whether we're advocating for that or not kind of boils down in some ways to having to pick your battles. It's unfortunately in our world, you can't fix all of the problems that exist at one time. And like Lerae just said, you got to have a floor to build on, and the most basic right is that of a minimum wage, that of overtime, and the right to bargain collectively. And if those can be established, it provides at least the floor on which hopefully farm workers can get to the same place that other workers are in other industries, and in that way, hopefully raise float the boat a little higher for everybody.
Thank you.
Do we have any more? We maybe have time for one more question if there's one in the chat or in the room. Any more questions? All right, well, thank you so much to all three of our panelists for coming and having this really informative, thought-provoking, and interesting discussion with us about the efforts in this and two nearby states to create that floor of rights for farm workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
and thank you especially to Claudia, who was basically the organizer. She's the person that approached Lerae and I to be on the panel. Thank you for doing that, Claudia.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here, everybody. And thanks to Ben for making this happen for us remotely. Wouldn't be able to be here without Ben.
Yes, thank you, Ben.
And
Thanks for
David.
moderating, and thanks Mike and Claudia and everyone who attended. Have a good rest of your afternoon.